from Common Core to the public statewide referendum on school funding. There's probably no bigger issue in Mississippi right now than public education. That's why we're especially pleased to have with us today two of the leading figures in the legislative debate over educational standards and funding. Our panelists for the discussion are Senator Gray Tollison from Oxford. Gray. And Representative Cecil Brown from Jackson. Senator Tollison served in the state Senate since 1996 and is chairman of the Senate Education Committee. He's become the Republican Party's leading spokesman on college and school issues. Representative Brown is a former chairman of the House Education Committee, has served in the State House since 1999 and become one of the Democratic Party's most respected advocates on education. The moderator for our discussion will be a familiar figure to us, Dr. Andy Mullins, who has followed education issues in the legislature for more than 30 years, served as the voice for the University of Mississippi's interests in Jackson. Hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for just a few questions from the audience, and I'll now turn the program over to Dr. Mullins.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody being here. And the reason I wanted to introduce Daniel is because he's in the Mississippi Teacher Corps. Both of these gentlemen have been key in establishing and having that program funded. So I appreciate both of them for their involvement with the Mississippi Teacher Corps and other issues of education that have affected Ole Miss. Both of them have been very supportive. As you know, this session has been anything but quiet on education. And generally, in my years working with the legislature, an election year was always welcome because it generally was quiet. As legislators tried to use whatever they had to make everybody happy before the election year. But this year they hadn't been able to do that as they've dealt with many controversial issues. And I've written down 7 of the most salient issues in K-12 education this time. And I don't know whether we'll get to all of those, but these are the 7 that, if possible, I'd like for each of these gentlemen to talk about. One, of course, is the Initiative 42 that all of us are so familiar with. Secondly is the Common Core and all of the controversies surrounding it. Third is the Literacy-Based Promotion Act of 2013, or as is commonly known, the third grade reading gate. Fourth is the voucher programs for special ed and various privatization bills that have been introduced and dealt with this session. Fifth is ADM versus ADA, average daily membership versus average daily attendance, which is the way that school districts have their MAEP calculations done based on their enrollment. Sixth is that the innovative districts have been allowed, with one bill I know that's still alive, to have virtual schools, which is controversial in itself. And then 7 is one that is near and dear to my heart. I was involved in the establishment of the National Board Certified Program for Teachers in Mississippi, and there's been a proposal to give them substantial increases, which would really help with our well-trained veteran teachers. And Mississippi has a large group of those, one of the highest percentage of nationally board certified teachers in the nation. So why don't we start with one that started the legislative session off with a bang, and that was Initiative 42 and the legislative alternative to that. And so Gray, of course, supported it, and Cecil opposed the legislative alternative to it. So we'll start with Senator Tollison and give his side of why he supported it, and then Cecil on his side why he opposed it.
All right, thank you, Andy. I used to be chair of Judiciary B that handled criminal law, and I suspect if I was here as Judiciary B chairman, we wouldn't have as many people in here today. And maybe I should have consulted Cecil as chair of education before I got into this. But I'm here and I'm enjoying what I'm doing and trying to improve education in Mississippi. But one of the first issues we faced as everyone here knows, is the initiative. And first I'll say I think the legislature has heard the signers of the initiative loud and clear. That is represented in the vote that the House took last week, 119 to nothing, to increase funding for MAEP to $106 million, I think. So I think that message was sent. But the initiative was about the Constitution and Article 1, Section 1, and the separation of powers. And we have the executive, legislative, and judiciary branch, as everybody knows. The legislature is in charge of making the laws and controlling the purse strings of our state. And the judiciary is in charge of interpreting those laws. The way this was drafted, it would change that in a what I consider a drastic way. I mean, I'm a trained lawyer. I've been practicing over 20 years. I'm in chancery courts. And the wording in this would be such that it would take out of usurp the power of the legislature to generally give education funding to a judge. And the key language in this is removing legislature. And I guess I'm going to read this to you because if y'all like me, you remember the existing Section 201 of the Constitution is the legislature shall by general law provide for the establishment, maintenance, and support of free public schools upon such conditions and limitations as the legislature may prescribe. The Initiative 42 states, proposed to protect each child's fundamental right to education and opportunity, the state removes legislature and puts state in there, shall provide for the establishment, maintenance, and support of an adequate and efficient system of public schools. Then second sentence, the chancery courts of this state shall have the power to enforce this section which appropriate injunctive relief. That sentence was put in there because they currently don't have it now. And that was obviously an intent to go, as I said, do an end run around the legislature. There are 174 members of the legislature. I think whether you like us or not, we as a body determine how we should fund not only education, but all the various services, whether it's the university, whether it's the corrections, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's our highways. We have to take a limited, finite amount of money and set our priorities. If this were passed, in my opinion, it would limit our ability on that. I'm concerned, I have a lot of concerns, as I said on the floor, about the unintended consequences. And one of the things is this. We have the MAEP, which is about $2 billion. But we also have about $115 million that the legislature has priorities. For example, National Board Certified Teacher, Mississippi Teacher Corps, a lot of things that combine early learning collaborative that don't go into the MAEP. So you have the MAEP pot and $115 million. What I'm concerned about is if a judge enjoined the legislature and said, you give $200 million, we're assuming let's just assume that the legislature gives about $100 million, so we have a $200 million deficit. It enjoins the legislature to immediately find $200 million to put in the MAEP formula. I have a great concern, and I think it's legitimate. That $115 million would be swept into the MAEP formula. There would not be any national board. There wouldn't be any more teacher corps. There wouldn't be any early learning collaborative. That's the problem that I see in this, and that's why we propose an alternative. And the alternative reads, the legislature shall by general law provide for the establishment, maintenance, and support of an effective system of free public schools. And the key thing that I think we needed to change 201, and one of the reasons is that last phrase, upon such conditions and limitations as the legislature may prescribe. That was put in 1960. And the legislature back in 1960 did not have good intentions in doing that. And I think that should be taken out, and that's removed in the other proposition. Additionally, there's nothing to prevent a court from suing someone suing, going to court and telling the legislature that you're not effectively funding, or the schools aren't effectively funded. But here's the difference between the two proposals. One, in my opinion, a judge could basically dictate how the money would be spent. In the alternative, he would just say, okay, legislature, y'all go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do. It gives more flexibility to the legislature. I know that's a lot to chew on, but I've thought about this a long time. I've talked to other people who know about the law, and you can't sit there and predict what could happen, but I think, in my estimation, that's what could happen of unintended consequences by passing that particular, the initial 42. And I know a lot of work went into it, but I do think it went further than it would be good for our state. And you got to remember, this is a Mississippi Constitution that was passed in 1890. This is not something to go lightly in the night when you change it, because this doesn't affect us next year. It could affect 20, 30, 40 years. So that was the reason that I felt like I should do what I did in terms of supporting an alternative. And I think in the end, I'm going to support the alternative. I think it's important to remove that last phrase that I talked about and have effective schools. But in the end, it's not about funding education. Funding is in the appropriation process. We fund education through appropriation, just like the House did. These two gentlemen in the House, Brad and Cecil, voted 119-0 to increase funding by $106 million. We've got $200 million more dollars. I think the Democratic proposal that Cecil and Brian had was 109 or something. I can't remember.
It was 90 off of MAP plus the teacher payroll.
But it was close to that.
Close enough.
And I think in hopefully 3 to 4 years, we will eliminate the deficit. Hopefully, if the economy continues to be good. I think it's realistic. We were in a bad time. Cecil was chair of education, going to speak more to the recession that we went through and the losses that we had in revenue. But for the federal stimulus money, we would have been in a world of hurt. And we're just now coming out of that. And I know that I'll defer to Cecil now.
Cecil?
Well, thank you for having us here today. I appreciate it. Pardon my voice. I have a cold. Can't do anything about that. And I'm sorry to sound like Clarence Frogman Henry or something. I want to differ with my friend Gray a little bit on this. To give you a little background, the initiative came about from a group of private citizens who came together, brought in some constitutional lawyers and said they were people who were very concerned about public education. They were Republicans and Democrats who came together and said, we have a problem, we're not funding our education, we're not funding our public schools as we need to. What can we do about that? They decided to try to amend the Constitution. They brought in some constitutional lawyers, looked around the United States at what they felt like were the best constitutional provisions all over the United States, brought in some experts from out of state who deal with education law around the United States and came up with this language. Over a period of about a year, they spent going through this. They then had to go through the constitutional process, the amendment process, where they had to get a petition signed by basically 117,000 people. They got about 190,000 signatures, people who wanted to amend the Constitution to support education. Now, there's some argument about whether people understood what they were signing or not. I don't want to get into all that, but they had 190,000 people sign. So then under our law, the way that works is once those petitions are signed off on by circuit clerks and Secretary of State, that initiative is going to appear on the ballot. So it's going to be on the ballot. It'll be called Initiative 42, and the language that Gray read to you will be on the ballot. Under our laws, again, the legislature has the option to offer an alternative to the language that was prescribed by the petition. So the legislature's never done that before. We've had other amendments that have gone through the initiative referendum process. Legislature has never offered an alternative, but this time the legislature did decide, or let me put it very clearly, the Republicans in the legislature decided they were going to offer an alternative, and they offered the language that Gray talked about. I can't get into the legalities of it. I'm not a lawyer. But I can tell you that from my perspective, based on what I know about it, at least on the House side, the alternative was offered to confuse the voters. The language was drafted over one weekend by one person on the House side. They didn't deny that on the floor of the House. And the language is so close, well, I mean, this was predictable. The language is so close to the original 42 that it is designed to confuse the people. Now, why would they do that? Well, under our law, in order for the initiative to pass and to amend the Constitution, not only does it have to get 50% of the votes cast on that particular issue, it's got to get 40% of the total votes cast in the election. So if you had 1 million people vote, one of those petitions would have to get 400,000 votes. Well, it's easier to defeat both of those if you split the vote between the two. So when you look at the ballot, what you're going to see, the first thing you've got to decide, I was not there when this was designed. I don't know whether you were there when this initiative process was designed or not. But the first thing you have to do on the ballot is say, there will be a question similar to, do you want to amend the Constitution to fund education? You have to check yes or no. Then you go down and say, if you do want to do that, do you want Initiative 42 or do you want Initiative 42A? And you've got to choose between the two of those. So if you split the vote on those two, it's very likely neither one of them will get 400,000 votes or 40% of the total vote, and neither one of them will pass. We raised that on the floor, and nobody denied that on the floor. I was not in the Senate. I can't speak to what Gray did or what the Senate people did, but the person who handled it on the floor asked specifically, will this dilute the vote? And the answer was yes. Now, I don't know whether he knew what he was saying when he said that, but that's the answer. So my concern is neither one of these is going to pass, and we will not. Now, I don't take amending the Constitution lightly either, but the fact of the matter is the legislature is not funding education. We're not doing our job. As far as the lawsuit side of it goes, we already got a lawsuit. Former Governor Ronnie Musgrove signed up 21 school districts who have sued the state of Mississippi, not under the Constitution, but under a statute that was passed in 2006, well, I basically authored when I was chair of education, that says the legislature shall fully fund MAEP. We're not doing that. So Governor Musgrove and these 21 school districts have sued based on that statute, and now we've got a constitutional issue which is completely separate from that. They're going different tracks, they're not related to each other. Governor Musgrove was not involved in the constitutional initiative. But the point is, there are enough people out there that believe that the legislature is not doing its job, then I think we need to have a serious debate of whether we need to take that out of the hands of the legislature.
Grady, you want a minute to stay on this? I'm gonna have to,
Yeah, I mean,
give you a minute.
regardless, if the initiative passed, it's not going to fully fund education. There's only one way, through the appropriation process. 174 members elected. There will be litigation for years. I think it's unconstitutional anyway for two reasons. One's a separation of powers issue. Two, under initiative, section 273, it's two subject matters. And I don't want to get into, but that is my opinion. But ultimately, as Cecil said, it's up to the legislature to fund the MAEP program. And again, the House, without a dissenting vote, voted $106 million to increase it. Now, people will say, why don't we use the rainy day fund? Because the rainy day fund is one-time money. You take $200 million out of there, where are you going to get it next year? We've got to use recurring revenue to fund the MAP program, because if you took $200 million, put it in there, and then took it away the next year, that would be the worst thing in the world to do. So I think we're on a track, and again, the Democratic plan is to do it in 3 years. I think that works. I don't see there's any disagreement about that. And $200 million, hopefully we'll have $100 million the next year and the $100 million the next year. But I don't want to get into a situation, as I said, this $115 million pot of money that goes to the principal corps at Ole Miss, that goes to the teacher corps for Andy's group, that goes to the board certification. I've heard the discussions. And they said, we can just sweep that into MAP and it would destroy a lot of good programs. And I don't want that to happen. Okay. So, and that is something that we need to be wary of in going forward on that.
Okay, Cecil, you got a minute.
All right, I'll take 30 seconds. The Better Schools, Better Jobs people who proposed the initiative had a plan that would actually fund it over 7 years. That was their proposal. And you'll see that when you go on the ballot, how would it be funded, and it's their proposal. That's not part of the constitutional amendment. But that's what their plan would be, to fund it over 7 years. It's a rational plan. Let me go back to the judge situation. There's no chance in the world that a chancellor is going to decide this. If, in fact, some chancellor ordered that, it's going to the state Supreme Court. We all know that. What would happen there, we don't know. The likelihood, let's suppose that a chancellor ordered you to fully fund MAP today, there's no reason to believe that he would necessarily say take the other money out of education. He'd just say legislature funded. We couldn't do that. We'd have to raise taxes, and we'd have to take the rainy day fund, all kinds of things. But this, if in fact there was litigation because we didn't do it, then it would go to the Supreme Court, and I agree, it would go on for years. But this is a fight worth having. We're either going to do it or we're not going to do it. The problem with leaving it up to the legislature with no constitutional mandate to do it, and by the way, the Constitution does not Neither one of these amendments speak to MAEP. They just talk about funding education. We could change MAEP tomorrow and fully fund it and see what the court said. So that,
All right,
Let me just say one thing.
all
that
right,
I
we
think
can
you
stay on
agree.
this one the whole hour.
Legislature could do a lot of things, and I was thinking the other day, I said, you know, $100 million, you could have a majority of the people push it down to the locals and say, and I mean, that's not unrealistic. There are a lot of things that could happen, as I said, unintended consequences of trying to raise money quickly, and it just concerns me that that could happen. So
Here's another one that we could stay on the whole hour, but I want to save 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So Common Core, and we'll start with Cecil, the attempts to dismantle Common Core or end Common Core. Your thoughts on that, Cecil?
my thoughts on Common Core is I don't care whether it's Common Core or what it is, we need high standards equal to Common Core. That's what we need. Now, Common Core is one way to do that. Common Core is not a federal mandate. There's nothing in federal law about Common Core. You all know the history of it. It was originated from the National Governors Association when Haley Barbour was governor, was part of it. And the chief state school officers came together and decided we needed high standards. They put together a task force, including people from Mississippi, who designed the standards that came out to be Common Core. They've now been adopted by 45 states. The difficulty with Common Core has been in the implementation, in my judgment, with the curriculum that has followed Common Core and the testing, which is so-called PARC test in Mississippi. But understand, curriculum and PARC have nothing to do directly with Common Core. Common Core are the standards. An example would be if the standard was to be able to run a mile in 6 minutes and you had a training schedule, the standard would be Common Core would be 6 minutes. The training schedule would be the curriculum, how you get there. The curriculum is where the problem is. Mississippi has not done a very good job in adopting a curriculum that will get you to the Common Core standards and training our teachers to use that curriculum. Very few of them have been trained in Common Core curricula, so they're not used to teaching the curriculum that would get you the Common Core standards. Other states have used other standards that have met the threshold of being equally as high as Common Core. The most recent one I'm familiar with is Oklahoma adopted their own standards, and Oklahoma has standards that the federal government has said are equal to Common Core. Now, why would the federal government be involved at all? They're not involved in Common Core, but what they are involved in is No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. And both of those federal programs require you to have high standards. The U.S. Department of Education said, you've got to have high standards, and oh, by the way, if you adopt Common Core, you meet that threshold. But they've also said you don't have to adopt Common Core. As long as your standards are high, you'll meet the threshold for No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. There's a lot of confusion about all this. I would ask the opponents of Common Core, show me a standard you object to. Pick out a standard, not a curriculum, not a book that needs to be read, but look at the standards. And they're on the website, by the way. You can go to the State Department of Education and look at the Common Core standards. Find a standard in there you object to. And if enough people object to that standard, let's get rid of that one. But let's don't abandon the whole thing. Common Core is designed to let our kids achieve at the same rate as kids in other states across the country and around the world. I think that's a good goal. If we don't want Common Core, get rid of Common Core. But for goodness sake, don't water down the standards in the state of Mississippi. We are last in educational achievement. There is a reason for that. We are not smarter than everybody else. We are as smart, but we are not smarter than everybody else. Everybody else can't be wrong, and we are right every time. It just ain't true. Okay, so at some point, we have got to have high standards for our children, and if we're not going to do it through Common Core, for goodness sake, let's do it some other way, and let's get on with it.
Ray?
I agree, and the issue was more of an issue in the Senate side of my good friend from the Tea Parties, who sit on the front row, and I had to debate with throughout that. But I lost a pound of flesh, I think, on that issue. That's really the toughest issue I've had because we had, as I said, people had a difference of opinion, but ultimately we established this commission to review the standards, maintain the standards, supplement them, not supplant them. And I think there was House Ed took it up yesterday and improved it. This commission would be, as the House has it, 15 members, and basically looking at the standards. Florida did this, North Carolina's doing it, other states have reviewed the standards, and if you read the Common Core States Initiative, it says we suggest that you supplement the standards. So it's not something unusual to do. An example is, well, in Florida they had 99 different additions, one of which is the state decided that cursive writing was important enough to include as a standard. Our standards, our Mississippi College and Career Standards, as we call them now, they don't have that. So that's if this commission becomes law, that's things they would require. Another thing is currency symbols. There's nothing in there about currency symbols. So if children want to learn about dollar signs and cents and things like that, that's the decision that this commission would recommend to the State Board of Education and then decide what to do. This is critical that we maintain it. There's no question, as Cecil said, the problem has been in the implementation of the standards. Some school districts have not done it well, and so it raises questions with the teachers, the pushback from the teachers and then the parents. More in South Mississippi than in this area. I mean, DeSoto County, I know they've been pretty active, and then South Mississippi, and some of my colleagues have gotten a lot of pushback from parents, but there's some districts doing a good job on it, and so hopefully we can maintain it. And the assessments. The State Board of Education did an RFP, and by the way, we have a State Board of Education member here, Karen Elam, who just got appointed by Governor Bryant, and they have an assessment RFP out to have solicitation for new assessments that will be adopted, and then they would have a 4-year contract, and the park assessments will go out. So that's good.
Okay. Cecil, anything else on Common Core?
No, we agree on Common Core.
Okay. The third one then is
Write
the
that
Literacy-Based Promotion Act of 2013. There have been estimates that at least a quarter of the third graders will be held back this year if that program is implemented. The Reading Gate, as it's called, based on a Florida model, been very controversial, at least the part of it that has to do with waiting a year before that you hold any of the third graders back. So, Gray, if you would address that first.
Sure. This came from Florida in 1990. Governor Bush, Jeb Bush at that time, I can't remember what year he adopted it, but it's been tremendous in improving third grade proficiency and third grade readers. And one thing should be mentioned, this is not about just third grade. This is about birth to third grade. And obviously, it's up to the parents until that child gets into hopefully an early 4-year-old program. But you're working with that child, kindergarten, first, second, and making sure they're reading. And that's one of the most fundamental purposes of school, is to teach a child to read. And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job. And unfortunately, I think this legislation is necessary to make sure that we have children reading, because why is it critical? There was a study done by the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Illinois and looked at 4,000 students. Of those students who were high school dropouts, 90% were about 88% were non-proficient readers in third grade. So you use research-based evidence and say, okay, if we have more children reading by our proficient readers in third grade, we're going to have less dropouts, we'll have more high school graduates, less crime, more workers, and then that's what we're trying to do. Early intervention, teach a child, learn to read so they can read to learn. And unfortunately, in our schools, we have 11th and 12th graders who are not reading on grade level. And it's shameful that that's happening. So I'm very supportive of this. And it's not just with, as I said, third grade. We need more money into the early learning collaboratives, pre-K. And the problem is you have to weigh that. I would rather put, Alabama has $150 million in their 4-year-old program. And we have this issue about money and what's a priority. I think that's money well spent. There's this guy, James Heckman, is a Nobel Prize winner, that talks about the earlier you invest in young people, the better your return. It's a 7 to 11% return when you're investing in 3 and 4-year-olds. But it's got to be quality care, and we've got the $3 million that we put in the early learning, and I hope we can double it this time. But that goes towards the third grade reading. There are 6 exemptions in the test, and you can have it. You're allowed to take it 3 different times. We have a reading panel. Angela Rutherford is a professor at our School of Education is on it. Kelly Butler with the Barksdale Reading Institute. Kim Bitton with MD, and principal down at Lille Elementary and Pass Christian, and another teacher from Rankin. They're worked very hard, MDE, to train thousands of teachers across the state that are in K through 3 and principals in those schools. This was called letters training to teach them the science of reading. And you know, there's a book called Teaching Reading is Rocket Science. It's not easy. You know the 5 components of reading, you have to understand that. So we're doing a lot, focusing on those early grades. One superintendent said to me, and I knew it was changing the culture in our schools when he said, you know what, Gray, that's making me put my best teachers in elementary school instead of secondary school. And that's what we need to be doing. The earlier we invest in our children, the better the payoff in the long run. And it's not just the schools, it's our communities. And I know Oxford and our community is working to make sure we support our schools, making sure our children to go to school. Attendance is a big chronic absence. You'd be surprised how many kids aren't going to kindergarten. And if you miss 10% or more, you're likely not going to perform as well. There's a direct correlation to that. And summer learning loss. We have the Horizons program here. So there's some good things important. It's just not in the rest of the state, which is a problem.
Cecil, you probably agree with all that. The question is, do you support delaying it a year?
I do, and primarily because of the funding. When Florida, I voted for it. I'm supportive of the reading gate. I think it needs to be tweaked. It needs to be carefully monitored to see what the various districts are doing. But the problem we have in Mississippi is we didn't fund it. In Florida, when they funded it, they brought in 1,000 new teachers in the state of Florida when they passed this program. Right now, we have 74 reading coaches. I think that's the number. 74 reading coaches for the entire state of Mississippi that are trying to teach all the districts, the teachers in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, how to teach reading. We're not covering the state. We asked that question on the floor, Brad, the question, how many do we actually need? And the answer was, we probably need 150. We got 74. The question also was asked, well, how are you prioritizing? And they're prioritizing, look at the districts that are failing. I think that's appropriate. However, in a district that's not failing, you still have kids that are failing who can't read. We all know that. In A, B, C districts, you have kids that are not succeeding who need additional help, and they're not getting any help. So to hold those children back, if you look at the language in the bill, the original bill, it talked about giving them assistance, giving them extra time, giving them coaching, lots of things to provide resources for kids who are falling behind, so they just wouldn't have this year-end test, pass, fail, and then be held back. They were going to get training and additional help all the way along, but we're not doing that in some of the school districts, or at least we're not doing it effectively. So the idea in the House was, let's delay it a year, let's put more money in it, let's hire these additional coaches, and just don't punish the kids who've not had the resources, the additional help that they need. And I think that's a debate you'll have with John and others. I don't know how that's going to wind up, but I'm really concerned about kids that are not being treated fairly and being held back because they haven't had the assistance they need.
And Gray, you're opposed to extending it a year, right?
Yeah, and we do have the money, and the State Department, the Board of Education makes a request each year. They requested $15 million, no more, and the amount of money is the same relative to Florida when they first implemented it, and we go back and forth about it. They have 5 times as many children, and they got Reading First money from the federal government, about $100 million. We got $100 million, and I'm still trying to figure out where all that money went. That was back in the mid-2000s. But the reading coaches, and additionally, we get all of our schools across the state get $179 million in Title I money, which can be used for reading coaches. The problem with the the reading coaches was they had 500 applications initially, and they only were able to get about 30 to 40 qualified. We want to go for quality, not quantity, in terms of the reading coaches, and they have over time extended. But certainly, I hope our schools, they have, again, we provided training to 8,000 to 10,000 teachers and principals on how to teach reading. And again, that's a fundamental skill that should be taught in our schools. And I hope that it is happening. So, and another thing about the cut scores, when you give a test in 3rd grade, you have 4 bands. You have minimal, basic, advanced, and proficient. The minimal is the bottom. And essentially, it was, I can't remember, 13% last year. The reading panel is going to set the cut score. It's going to be relative to what the cut score was last year, so it won't be any different about that. I mean, they're mindful of this issue, so yeah. I'm confident in the reading panel doing that.
Yeah, I am too. And looking at the numbers, it looks like about 6,500 kids statewide.
Somewhere in that range.
Would not advance. again, the problem is many of those kids have not had the assistance that they were promised when this reading gate passed. Not anybody's fault. We just don't have enough trainers. We don't have enough coaches. You didn't see anybody in the House. Well, I can't remember what the vote was in the House in the third grade gate. I'm sure some people voted against it. But they're not, the House is not opposed to the third grade reading gate. The majority of us had voted to delay it a year, wanted to delay it a year to get the additional assistance to give the kids time to catch up to where they need to be. And I don't think they've had the assistance. I don't think it's fair to hold them back. And by the way, the data pretty clearly shows when a kid is held back, the chance of that child graduating is substantially less than if the kid is never held back. So you're talking about 6,500 kids that are going to be held back in the third grade. And I did ask the question on the floor, okay, we got all these districts out there, you're going to hold back 6,500 kids. What kind of plans are in place to all of a sudden bump the fourth grade from 45,000 kids to 51,000 kids and move the fourth grade down? And there's no planning. The State Department, as far as the answer on the floor was, they've done no planning about that. Well, somebody needs to be looking at what happens when you hold back 6,500 kids. What's the impact on the whole system, and how do we deal with that? Are we going to take those 60, instead of just dealing with 45,000 third graders now, we got to coach 45,000 third graders plus an additional 65,000 that have already failed once. So you've got this bottleneck. We don't need fewer coaches, we need more because we got more kids in the system. There's no planning for that.
Social promotion has to stop in
I
this
agree.
state. If we're going to change the state, we've got to stop kicking the can down the road. At some point, we've got to say enough is enough. We're going to do what we can. And the study I have on my desk shows completely the opposite from Florida, that the children retained actually excel better in going forward. So, I mean, you know, you can have competing studies, but at some point, we've got to say enough is enough and focus our efforts on making sure children are reading proficiently in the third grade. I think it's the fundamental thing that we should be teaching is reading. And if we're not, as I said, we're never going to move this state forward.
One of our former House members told me one time, you know, from first, third grade, we shouldn't be teaching anything but reading.
Well,
Just 100% of the time. That's all we ought to teach.
yeah.
All right, we got about 6 minutes to spend on one of the most controversial items, and that's the voucher
Oh, yeah.
and special ed and attempts, privatization bills and so forth. So let's see, whose time is it? Cecil, you go
turn.
first on that one. Explain it and then tell us where you
Well,
stand.
the voucher bill in the House would have provided, I think, $6,500 for each child who had an IEP, individual education program, special ed kid, where the parents felt like the child was not being served appropriately by the school district. They could go to the school district, withdraw the child, and get a voucher for it. It's actually a debit card, if I remember correctly, to use on special ed training in approved facilities. Actually, I'm not opposed to that. I know you're surprised at that. I'm not opposed to the concept. My opposition to the bill was I didn't think there were enough safeguards for parents and children. When you look at the bill, for example, there's some language in there about how a provider has to be certified, but it doesn't say what kind of certification they have. Give me $500 and give me 15 minutes, I'll get a certification. I can go online and get one. I can go online and get a certification for life coaching that says I'm a life coach and I can teach you how to live the rest of your life, and all of a sudden I'm certified. One of the problems they have had in Florida, it hasn't been a major thing, this is another program that came out of Florida, hasn't been a major problem, but has been a problem, is that many parents don't have the resources to sort out what the appropriate provider should be, who that person should be. What kind of training do they need? What kind of certification? What does the certification mean? And so they go to a storefront that says, I'm going to take care of your kid. I'm going to teach your kid to read, or if your kid has physical problems, I'm going to take care of that. And oh, by the way, as soon as the $6,500 runs out, I'm through. They've had problems with that. I just don't want that to happen to parents and kids. I didn't think there was enough safeguards in the bill. But I am for homeschooling, I am for charter schools, I am for public schools, I am for online schools, anything that will help the child, that's what I'm for. It'll help the child and the parent. But there need to be appropriate safeguards to make sure that what is promised is what is being delivered, so that parents aren't fooled into thinking they're going to get $25,000 worth of rehabilitation services for $6,500, because that's not going to happen. And that's what's going to be promised unless we put some safeguards in place.
And I agree. I mean, you got to have accountability and make sure, but think about this. We do this for pre-K kids with our Child Care Development Fund. You may not know that, but there is about $70 million in federal money we spend on 32,000 kids that are birth to 4 years old. They can take that voucher or certificate and use it any church, private daycare, anywhere. It goes on all over the state. So it's going on in that level, birth to 5. And then think about it, and we got some students here, how many have a Pell Grant? A Pell Grant is, you give the money from the government, it's about $35 billion that goes to all and you can go to any school you want to, whether it's a public, private. So we're doing it on these two areas, and this is just a concept of with special needs, because I can tell you the phone calls I get the most are parents of special needs children and their frustration with, they feel like they're not getting the services they need. Rightly or wrongly, it's the conversation I have all over the state with children with autism and dyslexia. And dyslexia is another deal, but it's something that the Citizens for Coalition of Disabilities and Mandy Rogers, they go in there and they've got a particular law firm, and you introduced a bill about this.
I did.
That they are parents and they are represented by pro bono. And the school district has a lawyer, and they don't have any way to get the services unless they can hire a lawyer. And also you should know that school districts already send children, if they cannot provide the services, to a Mill Creek, which is a private institution. And so this happens already in our schools if you have the lawyer that you can make sure you get those free appropriate education services. So anyway, I don't know what's going to happen with the bill.
I wish you'd take up Bill David Bear.
I know.
Put it in your bill.
I think there's something to be said to figure that out, because the city of Jackson was sued because of the things they were doing to special needs kids. I may be wrong, but there were some bad things that were being done to special needs kids that shouldn't have been done.
Right.
And they finally settled the case after years of litigation. The Southern Poverty Law Center brought it. But the conversation was, we do need more attorneys working as advocates for parents. And I think that would go a long way to help this situation.
Okay, just quickly, do you think the increase for National Board Certified Teachers will become reality?
I hope so.
Tell us how much.
I don't know how much it costs. I don't know the numbers on it. We haven't really looked at it. We haven't had it in the house.
Just passed out of education. I can tell you real quickly, right now, if you're a teacher, after 3 years, you can go through a rigorous process, kind of like a doctor, and get board certification after you take an exit exam. When you get that board certification, you receive a $6,000 supplement over your salary. We have 3,700 board certified teachers now. The problem is they aren't going into our underserved areas. There are only about 200 in our underserved areas. The studies show that a board certified teacher can improve student achievement, and especially in underserved areas. Washington State did this, and they went in 3 years from 76 to 749 board certified teachers. So we're adding an additional 5,000, and then the House Ed amended it to 6,000. So you could, if you taught in an underserved area, you could receive a $12,000 supplement. So I'm hopeful that will pass, and we'll have more board certified teachers going to those underserved areas, because teaching is a critical component. One thing I'm really focused on is the teacher training and teacher pay, and looking at things like differentiated pay and things of that nature. So.
Okay.
Well, the only thing I want to say is teachers are the single most important part of the education process. The second most important is administrators. We have a real problem in this state with principals, superintendents. Not every superintendent, not every principal. We have some very good ones. And we have some that are not doing their jobs. And you can tell they're not doing their jobs by the output. You can tell by looking at the schools. I can take you to a school in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a D-level system. I can take you to a school that's 100% African American, all poverty level kids, that is an A-rated school. I can take you 10 blocks down the street, same demographic, same people, that's a D or F-rated school. The only difference is the principal in that school. That's the only difference. Now, I'm not an educator. I'm not going to lecture y'all about education. But by golly, I was chairman for 7 years. I heard what Gray hears. What you hear from people that some of these stories will break your heart. Kids that can't graduate. We had 3,200 kids. I don't know what we did this year. We had 3,200 kids my last year. Out of 450,000, 3,200 of them couldn't graduate because they couldn't pass the end of the year test. Now they'd all, these are kids that had passed every grade. They had passed all the tests during the year. They'd passed all their courses. They'd met all their requirements. They couldn't walk at graduation because they couldn't pass one of those subject area tests at the end. 3,200 of them. That breaks their hearts. I mean, these are 17-year-old kids that want to get out and go to college. We got problems like that we got to deal with. That has nothing to do with anything else we're talking about. But while we're talking about the bad stuff, I just want to toss that out.
Okay, let's.
Can I say something about the subject area test? Because this is an issue. We have to, under federal law, you have to take 3 of those. But you take Algebra 1, Biology, English 2, and U.S. History in 11th grade. And there is a problem with some folks. And because of that, the state board is looking at the issue of that's not required by federal law, that you have to pass whatever the cut score is in order to graduate. They may remove, they're looking to remove that. It would still be counted as part of that student's grade and part of the school's grading system. So that's something that is the state board.
We had a bill to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And
we had legislation.
Yes.
Okay, we'll open it now for questions, and please keep your questions on the education issues. We don't have time to discuss anything else. As you see right now, we've run out of time. We could go another 2 hours just on these topics we've dealt with today. So I see a young lady back there. Yes, ma'am. MAP.
Because there's no penalty. There's nothing to force the legislature to do it. That's what the Musgrove lawsuit's about. The Musgrove lawsuit is that the law says you got to do it, you're not doing it. I hate to disillusion anybody. We got a lot of laws on the books that we don't follow. That's just a fact. We've got a law on the books that says we're supposed to fund community colleges 50% of the what's called mid-level funding between IHL funding and K-12 funding. We don't do that either. We've got laws in the book we passed when I was chairman of education that require the State Department of Education to do this, and they just don't do it.
That's right.
Got those
That's right, absolutely. But let me say, here's something that's an example. Last year, the speaker came out with a proposal to raise teacher pay. I think it was a good proposal. And right now, we're in the 2nd year of that. It's going to cost $100 million. If we didn't do that, we would be $100 million less or in a deficit in MAP. But that was a priority of the legislature to put money into teacher pay as opposed to paying down the deficit on MAP. So, I mean, it's just a decision. I think teacher pay is important. So I'm going to stick with the $100 million going to the teacher pay right now. And I don't think anybody would change that. So it is 2 years and then another 3rd year. And we raised the first year up to next year, teachers' pay will go up to $34,390. So it was just a policy issue that the legislature said, instead of putting $100 million to eliminate this deficit, we're going to put it in teacher pay. So
let me follow up. I didn't mean to be flip about it. We went through a national recession where revenues for the first time, basically in recorded history in Mississippi, were actually negative, went down from the year before. We had a 2% decrease from the previous year. We've never had that happen before. We had serious financial problems. We had to cut everywhere. It's not the first time that has happened, but it's the first time it's happened to that extent. We had Hurricane Katrina, we had the stimulus money, we had the national recession, and revenues just fell out of the bottom. And there's some things you had to maintain. We had to maintain Medicaid, we had to maintain the highway patrol, things like that we had to do. So we cut schools, we cut universities. The universities, the total education system makes up about 50% of the general fund. If you're going to make substantial cuts to the general fund, you got to cut education. You got to cut everything, but you certainly have to cut education because it makes up 50% of the fund.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, the universities, unfortunately, there's a school district in everybody's district. There's not a university, and the universities still have not got back to the level where they were in 2008 because of the recession and the deep cuts. I mean, MAP needed $288 million in federal stimulus money to just shore it up. And then that went away, so we had to replace that over the past few years. So we're just now getting back to square one, and then because we were at zero. We had fully funded it in
we
09
were,
and 10,
right.
and the Governor Barber mid-year had to cut it. The legislature didn't cut it, but he had, by law had to cut, and the biggest part of the pie is education. So,
Okay. Question back in the back. Yes.
No, what I said was, if I remember correctly, I don't remember what year it was, when we hit the worst of the recession 2008 or 2009, tax revenues in the state of Mississippi actually decreased from the prior year by about 2%. That had not happened before, where we'd had slow growth. We'd had 1% or 0%. We'd never actually had a reduction of 2%. We had that for the first time. We didn't cut 2% across the board. Well, he's talking about a bill that passed the House that would phase out personal income tax for Mississippi residents over a period of 15 years. I opposed the bill. It ended up passing. I think it would do damage to every state program there is. Universities, colleges, K-12, wildlife and fisheries and parks, everything out there. We're talking about roughly 20% of the total tax revenues that come into the state at the end of 15 years would be eliminated. Now, there are a lot of arguments about, well, you could cut the budget over 15 years or maybe growth. You can't make it up through growth. You're not going to make it up. The numbers don't work. So that's a philosophical issue, but it's also a practical issue. What do we do if we cut state revenues by 15%? What are they going to do 15 years from now? The way it works, as I recall, is it cuts the lowest tax bracket first, and then it moves up to the 5% tax bracket over time. I will also point out that this was pointed out in the debate, 49% of Mississippi people don't pay income tax. They pay sales tax, they pay some ad valorem tax, they pay other taxes, but they don't pay income tax. So the tax cut itself, the $1.7 billion, would come out of only 50% of the people in Mississippi would benefit from it directly. Now, there's an argument, well, the tax cut would provide more money that would go back into the economy, and the rising tide would lift all boats and we'd all float away to heaven together. But that's not my perception of it.
Question? Yes, sir.
My question is, I'm from Mississippi. I live in Tennessee now, but I grew up in Mississippi. And going to other states, and I've lived in multiple states, the common joke is to sit around education. You're from Mississippi, you're obviously poor and stupid. You don't have good education there. Always brought up. And thinking now that maybe if I want to live in Mississippi in the future, raise a family here, how am I supposed to feel good about putting my children in potentially a public school when there's talk, as you brought up, that, oh, we have these bills in place, but they're not getting pushed through because there's no incentive to push it through, or there's no incentive to make it happen. There's no penalty against it. So how are we supposed to feel good about raising your
we've
kids?
got great schools. My children in Oxford schools, great school. You'll be fine. There are some great schools in this state, and there are some that aren't doing well, but all across this state, from the coast to DeSoto County and in between, there are great schools.
I agree.
And
100%.
quite frankly, people are migrating to where the public schools are good. And that's just the fact of the matter. If you're not going to do well, probably people are going to move to a place where the schools are doing well. And we're seeing that in Oxford. So I would recommend living right here.
This lady here had a question. Yes, ma'am.
The voucher idea for students with disabilities, is that a proposed bill right now?
Yes.
Could that family choose another public school district?
No.
This is just private school.
And we have a bill, we have a law right now for students with dyslexia. I think about $1 million is spent.
Yeah.
There's a school called the 3D School in Petal that does a great job with dyslexia therapists. And parents just feel like the therapists do a better job. And my understanding is that some schools, it's expensive to hire one of those, and we're trying to get some funds to encourage schools to do that.
Folks, we have school choice now. We got the School for the Arts, we got the School for Math and Science, we got the Blind and the Deaf School. If you fit any of those categories and you apply and you meet the criteria, you can go, and it's free. It's paid for by the state. It costs about 2.5 times as much to send a kid to the School for the Arts, the School for Math and Science, as it does to send them to a local school district. We pay for that. And I don't object to that personally. I mean, that's a policy decision the legislature made years ago, and we do that. So we already have school choice. We just don't have it on a broad base. We don't have it everywhere.
What I wish we'd go back is to like University High School was a lab school to train our teachers in a real world setting. We got rid of those, and that was the wrong thing to do. We need to move back to that. That's what normal schools are. Normal schools were where you had a college and then you had a high school right next to it and teachers could train. We need to go back to that, have residencies models. That's an area I'm real interested in working with our schools of ed to make sure we have the best trained teachers, and it would make a difference in our school classrooms across the state.
Got about 3 more minutes. Gray's got to get on the road to go to Atlanta to pick up his daughter. So one last question from anybody? Yes, ma'am.
I would be interested to know whether at the university levels all over the state, first grade, people that are applying to be first grade teachers in public school system, are they or are they not required to be able to know how to teach people to read?
That's a great question. And
If they're, then that's our big problem. Move them to doing something else and bring in people that are, and it should be part of their degree.
that's exactly right. And we need to work on that because I don't know if it's actually happening in some of our schools of education. But last year, I put in a little provision that says you have to have an end of the year assessment to show that you are proficient in teaching reading. And it goes into effect next year. And I mean, it may be kind of a shell shock for the schools of ed, but they know about it. And this reading panel is the one that has selected the assessment for that to make sure they have a proper curriculum to teach. We know how to teach reading. It's been settled. There's no question about it. We just need to make sure they understand the process that has been shown to be effective in teaching reading.
Let me follow up on that real quick. I once asked Dr. Bounds, who's Commissioner of Higher Education for another month, asked him, well, how many, we're talking about early childhood education. So, well, Hank, how many courses in early childhood education did you have? None. He was the superintendent of state education. He is the commissioner of higher education, had no training in early education. None, zero. Now, how can you get to be a PhD in education and not have any training in that at all? And everybody says that's one of the keys. So, I don't know.
And to follow up that, also just content knowledge, whether it's math, science, we have to, once you leave teacher education, you have to take the praxis too. And our scores are half of what the national average is. And we've got to change that. And I think it goes back to the School of Education. What is the curriculum? And what are they teaching so that we can improve the number of students that are meeting the national score on the praxis too.
I want to thank the Overby Center, our guest here. Obviously, they don't agree on everything, but nobody can really argue with their passion for education and their work that they've put in to improve